Good evening po, Sir Aldrin.
Good evening, Prince.
Dalawa lang po yung presenters today, ano po?
Oo, si Venus at si Andre lang.
Wala po si Sir Gerard.
Wala ata. Kasi baka ibang schedule siguro. Kamusta so far?
Okay naman po, pero parang long day para sa department, no? May lecture sila for the whole week, tapos may VIP naman ngayong Friday.
Oo nga, actually hindi ko nga rin natatimingan yung lecture. Puro ako lagi sa dulo na kasi may klase ako pag ganung oras.
Kaya nga, kawawa sila Anton, parang walang pahinga. Wala pa Monday.
Actually, yung buong semester?
Sila Anton, nung Monday pa lang parang busy na agad sila, no?
Oo.
Grabe. Kaya okay naman.
Ganun din. Meron lang sa ibang aspeto naman.
ibang naman, ibang events at saka ibang bagay.
Ibang category naman.
Pero nakakapagod talaga ngayon, no? Parang
nga eh.
Iba rin, iba.
Ano na ba yung in-enroll mo sa UST? Ano ba yan? PhD?
MA po. MA yung kinuha ko ngayon.
MA pala. Okay.
Parang second MA ko kasi yung isa is in education. Mas
Nice.
feel naman. Ganda ng feel sa UST.
Good.
Kaya po, sino bang philosopher nyo ngayon, Sir Aldrin?
Si Ernst Bloch.
Si Ernst Bloch, parang banggit nyo yata sa akin yan nung
sa Laguna.
Las Baños, sa Las Baños, Ernst Bloch. Si Andre po, parang nasa biyahe pa from work.
Yun lang.
So, kahit naman siguro late tayo mag-start, parang total wala pa rin namang tao para makaabot si Sir Andre.
Sabihan na lang natin yung mga audience para at least kasi parang kailangan mag-unawaan na lang muna.
Pero si Ma'am Venus yata ready na.
Ay.
Hindi ko rin alam kung paano ginagawa usually pag second whip Kaya, paaga rin ako. Oops.
Ano yung sabi mo? Sorry?
Yung lang, kasi hindi ko sigurado kung paano ginagawa pag sa second whip na.
Sa second whip? Ano naman? Bali, tutuloy mo lang yung Kung may improvement dun sa presentation mo before, sasabihin mo lang yung mga in-improve mo.
Okay.
So, hindi mo siya necessarily uulitin. Parang, siguro gagawa ka ng synthesized version nung pinresent mo last time. Tapos, pagkatapos may present yun, here are the additional things that I have made so far. Parang ganun.
Parang isasali lang din yung yung mga comments siguro ng first tweet na integrated sa paper.
Yeah, magbigay ka lang siguro ng quick kasi mamaya may mga audience na hindi umattend last time. Tapos bigyan mo lang sila ng quick preview.
Recap na nung tama. Yan, na si Ma'am Paula.
Ma'am Paula, hello.
Hello, good afternoon. Wala pang 6 sa evening.
Good afternoon na lang, Char.
Good afternoon.
Kamusta, Paula?
Ayos naman.
Yay.
Mic test lang ako. Naririnig pa ba ako so far, Ma'am Paula and Eric?
Yes, Sir Aldrin. Okay
Okay.
naman. Clear naman yung audio.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Venus.
Hello po.
Hello. Ayan, nandiyan na si Venus.
Ay, start na tayo habang 6 pa lang tayo.
Ready na si Miss Venus. Gusto nang mag-start agad.
Para, pagdating ng mga tao, tapos na.
Tapos magdi-disclaimer na lang. No? Naka-record naman po. Ganun.
Good luck.
Thank you po.
Good luck, Venus.
Parang nakakadagdag ng kaba ko yung good luck. Sige po, salamat.
Ayan, nandiyan na si Anton. Good evening, Anton.
Good evening.
Good afternoon sa lahat.
Magandang gabi po, Doc.
Good afternoon po, Doc. Ay, evening na pala.
Thank you po, Doc Jovi. Good evening, everyone. We will be starting in a few minutes. We're just waiting for more people to come in.
Okay, good evening po. Thank you po for being here. Siguro the rest will just follow, pero we could start right now. Okay, I'm Anton. Good evening po. Thank you for being here. And welcome to our third work in progress for the second semester. For tonight, we will have two presenters. First is Venus A. Basa, who would be presenting Interrupting Epistemic Injustice in Children, followed by Patrick Andre Mencias, with his paper From Otherness to Grievability, Tracing Levinasian Ideas in, I think, Judith Butler's Precarious Life and the Force of Nonviolence. So as usual, well, what you normally do is that Andre would moderate Venus's presentation, and likewise. However, Andre is still on his way home from work. He messaged us, so Aldrin would facilitate the discussion for Venus, and then afterwards, Venus would moderate Andre's paper. Okay. So without further ado, we welcome Venus.
Hello. Am I clear po?
Yes, Venus.
Wait lang.
Okay.
Good evening. Welcome to my work in progress. parang sana makaabot si Andre ng mabuti, no? So what I will be presenting tonight is my working thesis proposal. So the first time I presented some sort of abstract, or I let you know the parang my plans, and so far this is what I have.
Venus, excuse.
Yes, sir.
Paki-magnify mo nga ng bahagya yung presentation. Pasensya ka na, ha?
Opo.
Okay.
Ayan, better po.
Okay.
Actually, pwede ko pa lakihan. Ay, ayan po. Okay lang po. So,
Sige, pwede na yan. Salamat.
so this is entitled, the working title is Interrupting Epistemic Injustice in Children. The overarching aim of this thesis is to offer a critique of the epistemic injustice suffered by children. I advance that there is a need for a kind of epistemic turn on how we see and understand childhood, and how a consideration of the foundational elements found in P4C, or the philosophy for children, dialogue, sensitivity to positionality, multidimensional thinking, and self-correction, are crucial in our attempt to reconfigure how we understand childhood. In recent years, discrimination as a knower has been gaining attention as an important aspect of social and political injustice. Epistemic injustice, as articulated by Miranda Fricker, is the idea that one can be unfairly discriminated against in our capacity as a knower based on prejudices about the speaker, such as gender, social background, ethnicity, race, sexuality, or even tone of voice, accent, and so on. It is no surprise that the concept of epistemic injustice is being appropriated to children in various aspects of life, like medically, legally, and culturally. In considering the epistemic oppression suffered by the child, one naturally comes back to questions like, but what is a child? And who are the children? The task of overcoming epistemic injustice in children is particularly challenging, given society's inherent skepticism on the child's capacities and the innate tendency to cradle and nurture the child. Most of the time, it would seem that an adult's concern and cautious distrust of the child's capacity as a knower is, of course, rightfully justified, given children's natural limitations and limited experiences. We must qualify here that the contradiction of epistemic injustice in children is not credulity on the part of the adult listener. The question of epistemic injustice involves being socially situated within a space that is usually perceived with an underlying prejudice, consciously or subconsciously. It is being socially disadvantaged on the account of the prejudice associated with the individual's social position. Epistemic justice in children, therefore, is not the obliteration of any form of adult guidance and nurturing. It is not letting a 3-year-old child use a butcher's knife just because she claims that she is already capable of doing so. Even if she pinky promises that she will be very, very careful, we don't do that, right? This blue part here, this next part, I believe it's a very important part of my proposal, but I'm not yet sure where to put it exactly, so I kind of just lumped it here. So if we simply ask, this is a big segue for me. If we simply ask, so what is epistemic justice for children? We can already draw from the discussions of Fricker and, the tradition that followed her. Um, of course, once Fricker articulated the problem of epistemic injustice, her followers started trying to answer that already. And we can draw from those discussions, we can say that how we must be responsible hearers, how to make sure to pay attention to silence, and so on. And in that case, then I have no thesis to write. But what the thesis will do is explore another solution to the problem at hand, or maybe as simple as provide an alternate route on how we can go about the problem. And this is what the thesis is trying to do, to propose a reconfiguration of our understanding of childhood. And to aid in this reconfiguration, we shall use the P4C elements mentioned above. So, going back, the thesis will be using the philosophy of childhood as presented by David Kennedy and Walter Cohen, and the tradition of philosophy for with children as theorized by Lippmann and Anne-Margaret Sharp. Since Fricker's articulation of epistemic injustice, many researchers have recognized that such oppression is also experienced by children in different aspects of their lives, as I've mentioned earlier. I classify current literature into three kinds. First, those who deal directly with epistemic injustice in relation to children on a conceptual level. Second, those which appropriate Fricker's ideas and language in a particular context and then apply it to children in that field or area, like medically and legally. And the third kind of literature that I found was the engagement of P4C scholars with epistemic injustice and how they appropriate the notion of epistemic injustice within the P4C framework, because that's what they have been doing. Um, one of the earliest writers to engage with or produce the second kind of literature is Karen Morris. In her article, The Epistemic Challenge of Hearing a Child's Voice, she extrapolated Fricker's ideas and used them to make sense of how adults tend not to listen to a child's voice, particularly in the context of education, and particularly when the child is Black. Morris's article mainly advances the possibility of transforming pedagogical spaces to include children as educators. Hence, she proposes epistemic modesty and epistemic equality. She also maintains that the problem begins with how adults view childhood, education, and knowledge. As a way of moving forward, she advocates for the inclusion of P4C as a pedagogy. This thesis agrees with Morris in this aspect, but would strive to argue further that since the problem begins with epistemic prejudices, it is also a kind of epistemic turn that is primarily needed. Institutionalizing the P4C framework will not suddenly bring about authentic transformation without first transforming how society understands childhood itself. In the medical and legal fields, the role of children and their capacities as knowledge bearers have been extensively studied even before Fricker talked about epistemic injustice. Considering these studies play a crucial role in this thesis, the assumption that children are given less credibility as bearers of knowledge may not be new to anyone. But these studies fortify the gravity of such epistemic oppression. These studies from the fields of medicine and law show how much concrete damage and epistemic injustice can in children bring about in our society. In one of the earliest articles to talk about children's credibility, it was written in 1984 by Goodman, Golding, and Hayes. The researchers give light on jurors' reaction to child witnesses. They point out that for many legal commentators, the task of weighing a child's testimony is heavily colored by jurors' skepticism on children's credibility. However, since the courts have been allowing more and more children to take the stand as witnesses, the study of how jurors and other legal practitioners perceive children's testimony is imperative. The researcher's article is heavily referenced by recent scholars who are now looking into epistemic injustice in children. Because as I have mentioned, this study was conducted 1984, and the idea of epistemic injustice really surfaced at around 2000. The actual connotation of the term, it surfaced around 2007 only. So ultimately, the article illustrates how, when evidence is ambiguous, jurors' initial prejudice about children's credibility plays a huge role in determining verdicts. In one of the cases mentioned within the text, 11 students, 9-year-old girls, claimed that their elementary school teacher sexually molested them. Evidence was ambiguous, and the defense argued that the children just joined the bandwagon. Goodman et al. Concludes that the jury must have accepted that the girls were highly suggestible. In the end, they simply did not believe the children. Another aspect of their research is highlighting what contemporary scholars of today of epistemic injustice call hermeneutical injustice. One characteristic is that is crucial in court testimonies is consistency. But as the researchers point out, what is inconsistent with the standards of the adults might not necessarily be inconsistent in the child's mind. So, for example, children often answer questions too literally. A child may answer no to the question, were you in the man's house? But yes to the question, were you in the man's apartment? So, this it's interesting that this kind of analysis or this kind of fact or information was already around in 1984, but nobody has been paying attention to it. What is clear here is the child may lack the hermeneutical tools to make sense, yet that the two questions above are the same. These questions, however, can be easily used to exploit the child's natural limitations in a courtroom. In a review article that extensively in a review article that extensively and comprehensively engaged with the research developments in this topic, the researchers offered a few conclusions. Children can often remember significant events they have experienced or observed, but their accounts can still be manipulated like with anyone else. Skilled interviewers who are sensitive to the capacities and natural limitations of a child can avoid many of the problems that arise when the posed questions are inappropriate to the child. In other words, the responsibility must stay with the adult. The responsibility not to force their own language and understanding of the world must be consciously taken up by interviewers. Children, according to this research, can give information that is uncontaminated by the adult's influence and beliefs as long as proper strategies and techniques are utilized. In a more recent article which was influenced by the research of Goodman and company, Kim Oates talks about epistemic credibility accorded to children, particularly in the context of legal proceedings for sexual abuse victims. Oates' research proves how common misconceptions about children's memory and their capacity to relate it affect legal proceedings. She goes on to say that 69% of potential jurors believe that children testifiers are just most likely to respond the way the questioner wished. Surprisingly, 82% of psychologists also believe the same. Oates also touches on the adult's belief that it is easier to implant false memories on children than adults. Loftus, Rickrell, Resnick, Finger, and Hodge, with their studies, they actually all came to the same conclusion that people of all ages are susceptible to recalling events which did not occur. All ages. Therefore, a false memory implantation is not a specific weakness of childhood. If a memory is plausible, it is easier to incorporate it in our minds, regardless of one's age. From the examples of Oates, psychology seems to be on the other side of excuse me. Okay, from the examples of Oates, psychology seems to be on the other side of the conversation. That is, on the belief that children are not epistemically credible and that they are easily manipulated to give false testimony and information. And these are the next sentences are just my initial musings about this. All this might be coming from how the field of psychology is heavily influenced by the thoughts and models of Piaget, Vygotsky, and so on. Psychologists who are heavily criticized in the tradition of philosophy of childhood because of how they view children and childhood, and that is as lacking being or potential adults. Um, and another interesting thing to consider is these these psychologists are actually the pillars of modern psychology or of modern when you talk about child development or cognitive development in children, these these names are these names are parang I lost the word for it, but I hope you get me. So in all the textbooks and even with the study of psychology right now, even the study of psychology right now, this is the view. This is how they view children, lacking beings and potential adults. Um, Moving on, after 7 years from the publication of Oates' research comes a concise yet excellent article from Carol and Yorfi. They use the notion of epistemic injustice not just in navigating through oppression in legal proceedings, but more importantly, in preventing and intercepting child abuse. They cite the case of an 8-year-old child, Victoria Klimbe, wherein the child could have been saved from her abusers multiple times. If only anyone, from the nurses to the social workers to the police, and even to the pastors, bothered to really converse with her and listen to her. Kimby died in 2000 from hypothermia, multiple organ failure, and malnutrition. Her body had 128 separate injuries and scars. The pathologist reported that Kimby had been burnt with cigarettes, tied up for periods of longer than 24 hours, and hit with bike chains, hammers, and wires. During her life in Britain, Kimby was known to 4 local authorities, 4 social service departments, and 3 housing departments, 2 child protection police teams, 2 hospitals. So, all these institutions around her. Carol and Georgi advance in their article that sadly, it is not uncommon for clinical judgments to be skewed. Often, children are afforded a deflated credibility, while an inflated credibility is given to the child's carer, who is also the abuser. In cases like that of Klimby, when abused children are brought to clinics and hospitals, their injuries are easily passed off as accidents from the child's own doings. Even in decision and policy making which directly affects children, E. Webb, in his article Discrimination Against Children, points out that children are not included and always perceived as incapable. He cites that of 509 trust and health authorities in the UK, only 27 consulted children on services for chronically ill or disabled children, and only 11 of these went beyond consultation to meaningful participation in policy. These young people with serious illnesses feel excluded and marginalized in the decision-making process that ultimately affects their own lives. This reality is all the more surprising, given the evidence from the Child to Child program, which shows that children can effectively contribute to the process of creating health policies for other children. So what I took away from that is there's actual research on it. There's this Child to Child program, and they have research and they have facts saying that children can help. But still, with all these research and with all these works that are available to us, it's like no one bothers. So in the tradition that Fraker started, it is usually emphasized that experiencing epistemic injustice is an insult and it's a deep one. The intrinsic wrong of testimonial injustice is the epistemic insult. The subject is undermined in their capacity as a knower, and so as a rational being. The insult goes deep. If we accept that our rationality is part of the essence of human beings' distinctive value, then to be perceived and treated as lesser in one's capacity as a knower is to be perceived and treated as a lesser human being. I want to advance and maintain that epistemic injustice in children is perhaps even more profound, and unfortunately, usually with the worst kinds of consequences. As shown from the above literature, there are many cases wherein children who died in the hands of their abusers could have been saved. If only someone listened, if only the institutions and the society surrounding them at the time thought that what they had to say is important and worth listening to, those children should not have died in the brutal and terrible scenarios that they did. The fate of these children are included in the secondary practical harms of epistemic injustice, the primary harm being the epistemic insult. Burroughs and Tollefson in 2016 show how and why children should be seen as a class and a potential target group for epistemic oppression. We now move to literature which tackle epistemic injustice in children as it is, or in a more theoretical or conceptual level. Burroughs and Tollefson argue that children too have a social identity that, unfortunately, is heavily influenced and shaped by society's common conceptions of children as deficient, incapable, or incomplete in relation to the adult. This can be further understood by employing Freaker's use of the notion of social identity and how it informs social interactions. Further, Burroughs and Tollefson acknowledge that very little attention has been devoted to the impact of testimonial injustice on children. What is available comes from social psychology literature, which clearly shows how all these affect children in their development and education, albeit using different jargon at times. They demonstrate how children's self-perceived competence or incompetence is significantly impacted by other people's appraisals of their performances. And this is not very hard to imagine. Anyone who has had an encounter with a toddler can probably attest that children as young as these already know how to take social cues from the people around them. When a child is about to take on a task she is unsure of, most likely she looks around. She looks for other people's expressions and uses these to help her navigate her subsequent actions. Children who grow up in highly restrictive environments are often very conscious about authority and rules. Burrow and Tollefson's article is supported by Michael Baumtrog. He agrees with the need to consider children as a class. For Baumtrog, age also impacts social identity and stereotype creation. Although he makes it clear that children are not always victims of epistemic injustice, he emphasizes that the stereotypes surrounding the class mean that they can be, even if only subtle and sometimes considered menial. Baumtrog further provides a crucial questions that must be engaged in the attempt to unravel epistemic injustice in children in a more conceptual level. These questions will play a great role in shaping this thesis as I try to eventually answer them one by one. Baumtrog asks, how does the physical and social situation of childhood impact determination of just and unjust knowledge-based discrimination against children? What is important here is the assertion that not all knowledge-based discriminations against children are unjust and oppressive. It must be acknowledged that by definition, children are young, and with their youth comes important considerations. It is not that children should be left alone doing whatever they please to do, but perhaps it would not harm the adult listener to find out what prompted the child's beliefs and decisions in the first place. How, given their shifting developmental needs and abilities, should childhood testimonial injustice be characterized? In posing this question, Baumtrog introduces his idea of practical justice, wherein the child is further discriminated by unjustly discrediting him or her as a decision maker. The more pressing issue here is the notion of what is unfair and unjust discrediting. For other groups, in the context of race and gender, there is no need to intensively qualify these terms. This is because the foundation is simple enough. All persons, all human beings, have dignity and are equal in their personhood. Why then do children fall into the cracks of this statement? It goes back to our idea of what childhood is, or what children are, and that they are not, their personhood are not yet complete or actualized, for lack of a better term. Baumtrog further asks how, given their shifting developmental needs and abilities, should childhood practical epistemic injustice be characterized, and what is its relation to its theoretical counterpart? Baumtrog further deepens the discussion with children and hermeneutical injustice as defined by Fricker. Hermeneutical injustice occurs at a prior stage, when a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their social experiences. It is caused by structural prejudice in the economy of collective hermeneutical resources. For Baumtrog, children are epistemically injustice in two levels. The first is the systematic exclusion of children from the design and implementation of their daily activities, predetermined routines, education, etc. The second one, or the deeper level, is the perpetuation of the default world of the adult social and communicative understanding. The second level is so deeply ingrained in our society and intellectual tradition that Baumtrog even suspects that when Fricker discussed collective understanding and collective interpretive resources, it is most likely that children were not even on her mind as she conceived of those ideas. So Baumtrog's last question, how can childhood hermeneutical injustice be characterized given the fact that children's lack of access to the communicative and social resources held by the majority is in many cases simply biological. This is the last paragraph. Now, the third kind of literature reinforces this thesis's objective of using philosophy of childhood and philosophy for children in engaging with epistemic injustice in children. Scholars from the field of P4C and COI usually only appropriate epistemic injustice within the P4C COI context and not with children in general. In Peter Elicor's Mapping Identity Prejudice, Locations of Epistemic Injustice in Philosophy for with Children, he presents how epistemic injustice finds its way into the practice of P4C COI. The article further provides a short review of literature of how P4C scholars engaging with epistemic injustice and using it within the COI framework. Elicor then focuses on how children can be epistemically oppressed in a school setting, wherein the roles of students in societies intersect. And at the same time, their positionalities affect their relationships and engagements with the community. Later on, we shall also utilize the advancements of these scholars in arguing how important it is to consider positionality in our reconfiguration of our understanding of childhood. So the next parts are just my what I imagine would be my research design, but I haven't written it yet. So just maybe this last one. Identity prejudice is anchored on epistemic prejudice, and the way to contradict this also requires a kind of epistemic turn. This is why we need to rethink our understanding of childhood and also consider the concepts of P4C COI, a framework wherein epistemic oppression in children is scarce and self-corrected. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Venus. Okay. Thank you for that presentation, Venus, and to all the viewers of our Work in Progress seminar and session. The floor is now open for your questions, clarifications, and insights that you want Venus to hear or understand. You may click the raise hand button if ever you want to be acknowledged. Okay, the first question is from Dr. Jovito Carino. Go ahead, Sir Jovi.
Salamat, Binus, sa presentation mo. No? Magtatanong na ako para lang may magsimula. Tapos yung tanong ko is coming from someone who is not really steeped in philosophy for children literature or practices. So, consider them as questions coming from my ignorance, siguro. Kumbaga, I'd like myself to be more educated about the issue. And in the process of asking the questions, sana makakatulong din sa research mo. No? I'd like to begin with something that is quite basic. Ang gusto kong itanong, ano kaya yung larger philosophic motive ng research? Kasi sa philosophy naman, you can practically write about anything. Pero ang bottom line lagi, whether what you intend to write on is guided by a larger philosophic motive. Doon ako magsisimula. And then let's see kung saan tayo dadali ng iyong sagot. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, sir. I'm not sure if I understood it correctly po. Pero I think the most parang feeling ko po yung sagot ko is nandun sa pag-advocate ko or my advancement that there's a need for a kind of epistemic turn on how we understand childhood. Because right now, in its very basic terms, we understand children as, you know, as potential adults, as
Yan kaya akong pasagutin mo para to give justice to your claim about epistemic injustice. Anyway, sige, go ahead.
Ayun, parang yun, in its very basic level, that's how we understand children and childhood, or, you know, the mode of childhood. What I'm trying to advocate is that we look at childhood and children in a, you know, in a drastically different manner, in a way, because as I have mentioned, currently when you turn to psychology books or to when you turn in, you know, in the sciences, the way they understand children, it's really just developmental, or and yung mga yon highly contested ng tradition. Maybe in a way what I'm really trying to do is my first claim is that P4C-COI has all these rich understandings. They all have these rich discussions about childhood and children. But scholars in this field never really go out of P4C-COI. When they talk about epistemic injustice, it's only within the P4C-COI framework or their practice. So what I'm trying to do is to, you know, I'm going to use their elements and apply it to children in general. Parang ganun. I'm not sure, sir, if it makes sense.
May sense. I mean, you got my question right. I'll just provide a response to your answer and then give some comments and then yield the floor to others. This is my discomfort kasi yung unang-una, you write your paper well. Naintindihan namin. And documented then properly. Ang sa akin, kaya ako tinanong yung larger philosophic motive. Kasi here you are, an adult talking about childhood, describing it the way you see it, making assumptions on your own epistemic biases. I mean, based on your own epistemic biases about childhood. Kaya parang sabi ko, is this not another case of epistemic injustice. Kasi you're working on adult categories about childhood. We might even argue na baka this is another case of an adult projecting her own ideas about childhood. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just providing siguro some points, no, that might be a leverage for or against your claims. Kasi parang, yes, there might be an epistemic injustice in a sense na we don't understand children all the time, in the sense that we tend to underestimate them all the time. Pero ang question ko how does it become a philosophic issue na, and even if it is, paano masosolve ito ng isang epistemological approach or hermeneutic approach? Kasi if that's the approach, if that's the attack, let's sort it out using hermeneutics, let's sort it out using epistemology, then you're just approaching the whole problem at a very theoretical level and not at the level of justice. Kaya yung sinasabi ko kanina na ano ba yung larger philosophic motive? And then, last 2 points, no, and then I'll shut up. Yung isang point ko, walang problema sa the way you write your paper, pero right now, it seems to me very anecdotal. Ay, ibig sabihin ng anecdotal, you get testimonies from this author, that author, put them together, prop up your claim. And someone else can exactly do the same against your point. I can even prove to you, using the same strategy, that dolphins are wiser than most Filipinos. Yun yung problema ko doon sa you write clearly, you write very well, pero I'm expecting more from you dahil nasa graduate school level ka na and you're almost lapit ka na doon sa gate papalabas ng MA. Baka at this point, that approach of writing a thesis that relies on anecdotal testimonies of various authors might, ewan ko kung it might help bolster your claim or it might work against you. Kasi nga sabi ko, kung ganun ang takbo ng argumento, someone else can do the same, rebut you, and where does that lead you? Kasi parang, naniniwala kasi ako, Venus, sa importansya ng coherent na teorya, na theorizing when it comes to MA thesis. Yung kay Freaker, you talagang you squeeze all the pulp out of Miranda Freaker. Mukhang that is not enough yet. You can make, I'm not sure if you can make a case out of a single claim done by a single author. And then simply, yun nga, para bang palakasin mo lang ito ng palakasin, beat him up or her claims up by citing testimonies from other researchers here and there. Into muna ako doon. Thank you, Venus.
Sir, wait. Sir, I have a question lang po with your concern because the what I have presented right now is nowhere near my thesis. I mean my actual projected thesis because this is for TW1. I mean so with with the anecdotal part of of gathering information from other researchers, that's actually my RRL po. So I'd like to ask if the comment stands. Do you parang ayun po, even if this is actually my RRL.
Do you want me to say something?
Opo, sir. Opo.
Ah, kahit kasi RRL, we usually tell this to our to the students approaching us for advice sa kanilang thesis. Yung RRL is not just a string of articles or books that you've read. This is supposed to be a landscape of your journey to find that theory na either you will argue for or against. Adapting Miranda Fraker's theory, sa tingin ko, is kulang. That's hers. Go back to what you've written. Here is Miranda Fraker, and Miranda Fraker is seconded by these authors. And I agree with all of them. Siguro sa conference paper, that will do. Pero, anong nangyari? You just use Miranda Fraker and all the books that you've cited as parang, it's not even RRL, it's just a simple background of the study. I mean, where do you put yourself in this current scholarship about philosophy of childhood or philosophy for children or community of inquiry? Merely saying that you agree with Miranda Fraker, sa tingin ko, is not enough. I have other concerns about the cultural dimension of your work, pero let's set that aside. Alam ko mas marami pang mas sensible na tanong coming from the other members of the GME.
Thank you, Pastor.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Jovi, for the question and for answering Venus. The floor is still open for other questions. You may click the raise hand button on the right side of our Google Meet room if ever you have additional questions. Any questions from our audience? I think Sir Pao is raising his hand. You're acknowledged, Sir Pao. You may now ask your question.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, Lo.
Yes.
Sorry. Hello, Venus, and hello to everyone. Well, first, I'd like to apologize. I wasn't able to listen to your presentation, and I'm just picking up the discussion of your exchange with Dr. Jovi. I think regarding the if I heard it correctly, what you presented is supposedly your literature review. Um, I'm not since I wasn't able to listen to your presentation. I actually don't know the content of your literature review. But just to follow up on what Dr. Carino uh, mentioned earlier, I think yeah, it's understandable, and we are in a work in progress seminar, so it's understandable that presentations are, well, expectedly, as a matter of fact, works in progress, no? So I think the tentativity of the language of a presentation is something that is expected in a work in progress. But I think what Dr. Jovi was trying to point out is that, and this is not, and this is of course a tip or a message to everyone who is writing a literature review, whether in the undergrad or especially in the graduate school. If a literature review is something necessary in your thesis, because there are theses that don't have any literature reviews, at least in the introduction, but the it's compensated by critical discussion of secondary literature in the main chapters. But in most cases, students write a separate section for the literature review, and most of the time, that section is located in the first chapter or in the introductory chapter. And that's, of course, a well accepted practice. But I think what graduate students or students need to realize is that when you're writing a literature review, the language that you will use must shift from yung nabanggit din ni Doc Jovi kanina, the language that is I cannot think of a better term, but it's more like a descriptive language, when you're describing what's written or what's going on in a particular literature, a book, or a journal article that you are reviewing or commenting on. I think the literature review, the language of a literature review should shift from that descriptive style to a rather critical, language, which means that you take what is required, as a matter of fact, is that you take issue with the arguments and the debates, no, that are involved in the literature. So I think that's where Doc Jovi is coming from. What he's trying to say is that the language should shift from the descriptive to a more critical language when you're writing your literature review. So what that means is that, and there are, of course, many ways of writing a literature review. It could be a straightforward review, but I should add, it can be a straightforward critical review of existing literature, right? Or you can even write your literature review or present it as if you're presenting an intellectual history or the development of the idea that you are I call this, that you are discussing. For instance, if you are if your topic is on epistemic injustice, the literature review could be presented as a kind of critical intellectual history of that philosophical idea. So that means that your review need not be only journal articles from the past 5 years. It could be elaborate, it doesn't, but you have to play the language economics game, meaning you have to strike a balance between comprehensivity, being comprehensive and being succinct at the same time. Kasi the literature review does not have to be more than 10 pages sometimes. Masyado lang mahaba nga yung 10 pages sometimes for a literature review. But so you can present it that way. It can be a critical intellectual history of the idea of epistemic injustice. Or you can focus on reviewing the contributions of contemporary commentators on epistemic injustice, and then also on if there are specific texts on epistemic injustice in children, then but what is important is that you take issue with the arguments. You take issue, so the language that you use should be more critical. So yeah, I think I just wanted to contribute, and at the same time also clarify what Doc Jovi was trying to tell you regarding the literature review. So yun lang. I'm sorry for talking too much, pero hopefully I made sense.
Thank you po, sir.
Thank you, Doc Pao, and thank you, Venus. Do we have further questions and insights that we want to ask to Venus from the audience? Again, you may click the raise hand button on the right side of our Google Meet link room so that we can acknowledge you if ever you have follow-up questions or clarifications on the work in progress paper of Ms. Venus.
Arlene, habang wala pa, may I speak again?
Yes po, Doc. Go ahead po.
Okay, last na to, Venus. ano yung ina-anticipate mo na end of the thesis? Where will this research bring you?
Hello. Actually po, as I have mentioned, I think parang katulad din ng sinabi ni Sir Pao, yung present ko po ngayon, wala pa talaga siya dun sa thesis. The point was just to try to show the need or the gap in research. In the future, I'm hoping to create a framework. Well, a framework of understanding childhood to address epistemic injustice while using the foundational elements in philosophy for children, which are dialogue, sensitivity to positionality, multidimensional thinking, the community of inquiry's propensity to self-correct. And so those 4 elements, I'm hoping to create, in a way, an interplay between them or among them. And then when I finish that, so I'll use that to understand or to aid or to just to reinforce my claim that childhood should be understood in a different way. That childhood is a mode of being, that it's not a simple, yun po. Parang mag-create po ko ng something dapat.
So, tama ba intindi ko, you're not yet fully convinced that this will be parang thesis worthy? Hindi pa ito yun?
Convinced naman ako, sir.
Hindi.
Convinced
Kasi
naman
sabi
po
mo, convinced ka naman.
Pero I mean, ang hindi pa po ako parang 100% sure is kung totoong ano yung magiging conclusions ng further research and writing na gagawin ko. Parang, ayun po.
I think the last time you presented, parang there were suggestions about the need to specify or clarify a context, no? Di ba? Natatandaan mo ba yan?
Opo. Sir, ang napuntahan ko po doon, ang dinagdag ko po from the comments of last time, ang dinagdag ko po is this, nag-focus po ako, nagpalit ako ng focus kasi last time, ang idea ko lang was to interrupt epistemic injustice using the elements of philosophy for children. Ngayon po, ang ginawa ko na is kailangan magkaroon ako ng kind of epistemic turn, yun po.
Okay.
And children in general po. Kasi as I've shown dun sa literature, ang ginagawa na talaga ng mga ibang scholars even before pa is sa loob lang ng fields nila. Even with P4C scholars, ang ginagawa lang nila is sa loob lang ng fields nila. And I have not found any literature so far na nag-address dito ng parang children in general or cultural maybe. Ayun po.
Okay, salamat Venus for enlightening us and sharing with us your paper.
Thank you po.
Thank you, Doc Jovi, and thank you again, Venus. Do we have any further questions from our current audience? If we don't have any further questions, I think we can proceed with our next presenter for the day, Patrick Andre Mencias, and I will be passing the moderating floor to Venus. And Patrick's paper is all about, it's entitled From Otherness to Grievability, Tracing Levinasian Ideas from Judith Butler's Precarious Life and the Force of Nonviolence. Patrick and Venus, you may now take the floor.
Hello, good evening po. Good evening po everyone. Hopefully narinig po ako, yes?
Yes po.
Yes po.
Okay, hello. Okay, so I'll just allow me to present na lang po yung screen. Okay, hopefully nakikita na po. Yes, nakikita na po, yes. Ano po? Okay, so again, good evening po. For today, I will be presenting a work in progress po na paper na actually itong work in progress na to, nanatili siyang work in progress kasi natenga yung progress niya. It was supposedly pinasa ko siya in a conference in yung Boston Graduate Conference in the US, kaso na-reject. So tinak ko na muna yung pagsusulat and focus muna ako on other things in the graduate school tulad yung sa compre and everything. Pero nevertheless, kumbaga may naisulat naman ako hanggang sa introduction po niya. So this is actually just a very short presentation for tonight, and well, kung yung na-reject po siya, pero that's okay. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger po. Siguro I'll start discussing na rin lang po. So the title is From Otherness to Grievability, Tracing Levinasian Ideas from Judith Butler's Precarious Life and the Force of Nonviolence. So the abstract, Judith Butler describes Emmanuel Levinas' ethical responsibility as a Jewish ethic of nonviolence. In Precarious Life, she re-echoes Levinas by emphasizing our intersubjective encounter with the other through the face as an overcoming of our violent tendencies. Such encounter signifies our responsibility for the other and how one realizes the precarity of life. However, it is interesting to note that her recent work, The Force of Nonviolence, rarely mentions of Levinas despite her concept of grievability for the other being heavily pronounced with a Levinasian connotation. Surprisingly, there is an affinity and a disengagement of Butler towards Levinas. This paper aims for a rereading of Butler's works from a Levinasian lens. I first traced the development of Butler's thought from the precarious life to the force of nonviolence to underscore an understanding of life as either precarious or grievable, as an impetus for resistance against violence, and as to safeguard the life of the other. I then examined how Butler understood Levinas by fleshing out other ideas and to supplement it with other Levinasian ideas, such as his view of death and the understanding of the political dynamic in which it may strengthen her arguments. This is followed by an insight where and why Butler disengages from Levinas. Sorry, yun nga, work in progress. I do so by exploring her ideas on nonviolent resistance and a certain Levinasian response to her distress from his ideas. By way of conclusion, I aim to examine Butler's work as an appreciation of her as an excellent reader of Levinas. The development of her thought from precarious life entails how ethical responsibility navigates into the political by revolutionizing his idea as the other as grievable and worth the sustained aggression for nonviolence. So ito po yung introduction po. There is no doubt that Levinas' philosophy continues to emanate its reminder for one to rethink of our responsibility for the other. Jacques Derrida's Adieu to Emmanuel Levinas notes how his philosophy changed the landscape of thought, of which the central concern of philosophical ideas is geared towards the other. His philosophy opens significant themes in philosophy such as the ideas of otherness, difference, alterity, and etc. Dr. Fleur would also regard Levinas as a postmodernist due to his flexibility in different fields in philosophy by being an existentialist, phenomenologist, pseudo-deconstructionist, and a proto-feminist, etc. It is no wonder that the philosophies of Sartre, Marcel, and Marion and Merleau-Ponty were heavily influenced by Levinas, since it was arguably the French Jewish Lithuanian philosopher who brought the phenomenological tradition to the French thinking circle. Hence, in examining the fluidity and the dynamism of Levinas' thought does not simply boast about his influence in the discourse of contemporary philosophy. Rather, this is an invitation to see Levinas not as simply as a philosopher that reminds one of his responsibility for the other, but he is also a thinker that disturbs social structures and academic disciplines that starts from the ethical. Judith Butler, on the other hand, writes handful of insights and papers pertaining to the value of life, vulnerability, and the importance of resistance. Her article, Precarious Life and Death, an insight of viewing life as precarious in the encounter of the face of the other, and what does it mean to overcome our murderous tendencies in order to become responsible for the other. This article of Butler has been regarded by Levinasian scholars such as Peter Atherton and Matthew Calarco as an important example of the third wave of Levinasian scholarship, where Levinas' philosophy takes its relevance in different fields and disciplines. Yet it is interesting to note that her recent work on the force of nonviolence would rarely mention of Levinas, despite how the chapter of the grievability of the other has its Levinasian undertones, especially how the idea of death of the other becomes an impetus for responsibility, and the anti-individualist view of life towards an ontology of interdependency. This paper, therefore, is not to simply point out whether Butler is a Levinasian. Rather, this is to re-explore her understanding of Levinas' ethics and to assess the dimensions where she innovated his ideas, especially to that of realizing responsibility in the political. to the extent of resistance towards political tyranny, and to examine her disengagement with Levinas, where it is said to be rooting from Butler's critique of Zionism, and also to show how one can learn from Levinas through Butler's contemporary thought. Siguro, okay, so, kumbaga ito, so that I end there, hanggang dyan lang po yung muna yung natapos ko po. And ito po yung projected po na parang chapter, ano niya. First po, yung I will be discussing yung philosophy ni Butler from precarious life until the force of nonviolence. Parang, the way kung paano ko siya nabasa is that the precarious life is at least 2012 until 2020. So, pero meron pa rin siyang space in between that in which may nasulat pa si Butler na parang nabuo yung development of thought niya. Parang at first po, yung first article of Precarious Life towards yung responsibility for the other. Yung sumunod na article niya is Precarious Life and the Cohabitation of the Other. Yung article na yan, doon niya naidagdag si Hannah Arendt yung idea of cohabitation, in which doon niya na-apply yung idea of precarious life within a political dynamic. And then, so on and so forth po, hanggang dumating na po sa the force of nonviolence. Yung number 3 po, yung the Butler's treatment of Levinas ideas. Well, this is more of fleshing out kung ano yung mga nagamit ni Butler sa mga kanyang yung ideas ni Levinas to ayun po, and siguro this is to have a dialogue with Levinas and Butler once again kung ano nga ba yung ideas na nagamit, and at the same time where can they agree and perhaps where can they disagree, and at the same time how can Levinas perhaps give another idea that would supplement her arguments. And lastly po, yung the disengagement with Levinas, ito kasi dumating yung point na kung yung sa critique of Zionism ni Judith Butler, there was an instance though that Levinas had I think she got it from an interview na Palestinians does not have a face. May ganun parang nabanggit daw na parang it's difficult to say that Palestinians doesn't have a face. Yun yung kumbaga yung parang doon ko nakita yung distancing ni Butler kay Levinas kasi nga that's ganong statement. Although the intention of this chapter is to, well, not necessarily to win it back, but rather to assess that kind of problem with Levinas. Kasi Levinas had, to some extent, Levinas said that yung Palestinians do not have a face, but yet in another interview, nung tinanong siya if whether the SS also has a face, sabihin niya na the answer is painful every time. So parang may certain contradictions din kay Levinas, parang bakit sa SS may face, bakit pero sa Palestinians wala, and hindi ba dapat when it comes to ethical responsibility as to become responsible for not only the other and also for the other, hindi ba dapat pati din yung mga Palestinian? But yeah, I guess dito mas malilinawan siguro kung paano. And conclusion wise, well, hindi ko pa po nakikita kung pero I'm just hoping na maisulat ko po siya and I'll see where it goes. The reason why I'm writing this paper is precisely because this is perhaps a way of, first po, I want to perhaps give another dynamic to Levinas na he's not just a philosopher that we can just talk about halimbawa the face, the other. Tapos parang, kasi when we talk about Levinas, parating naiiwan yung discussion on the face and the other. Tapos na. Parang, minsan, alam, tumarating din yata sa point na parang nagiging pity party lang daw yung philosophy ni Levinas, or to some extent, ano nga ba yung political relevance ni Levinas and everything. And this is perhaps a way to reopen the dynamic of Levinas na meron din siyang political dynamics din na maganda ring i-explore. Pero the problem, yung ano nga lang dun, the problem why siguro hindi na na-explore si Levinas in the political it's precisely because when Totality Infinity was published in 1961 and na-translated siya to the English by Alfonso Linguis and Adrian Pepperzak, so biglang na-publish din yung Violence and Metaphysics ni Jacques Derrida, kung saan Jacques Derrida's critique of Levinas, yung sinulat ni Derrida against Levinas was mostly understood as a critique. Kaya at that point nagkaroon ng distrust. At medyo na-late na publish ang Otherwise Than Being, in which it was a response towards the Violence and Metaphysics ni Derrida. Kaya yung Otherwise Than Being contains the very political dynamic of Levinas na ayun nga, hindi na siya masyado na discuss further. So ayun po, yeah, so ito po this is simply a work in progress po talaga, and I do hope na, I don't know whether this is something that is worth venturing with, because I also think that I'm having an interest in of going into the philosophy of Judith Butler, especially when I've read The Force of Nonviolence. Siguro coming from a Levinasian standpoint, yun yung parang springboard ko towards Butler. And yeah, yun lang po siguro yung ano. So without further ado po, I end my discussion here, and I hope to have a fruitful discussion po. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjay. The floor is now open for your questions po and insights. Sir Pao Bolaños, I think, has a question. Yes, sir po.
Well, do I have a question?
Ay, sorry po.
Ako yung nagtaas na kami, Venus.
Sir Joey. Sir, magkatabi kasi eh. Sir Joey po pala.
Joey muna.
Salamat, Venus. And thank you, Andre, for sharing with us a piece of your research. Siguro, sa simula, gusto ko lang itanong, so, what is your take on Butler's reading of Levinas? Kasi you are taking on to highly respected and influential intellectuals. And you already mentioned na Butler is rather severely critical of Levinas, no? Although she appropriates basic insights of Levinas. I just would like to know what is your take on Butler's reading of Levinas? And in your reading of both, are you becoming more and more Butlerian, if that is an appropriate term, or you would like to stick to the traditional reading of Levinas?
Hello po, Doc. Ayun po, thank you for the comment po. Siguro ang first impression ko po talaga on Judith Butler's reading of Levinas is very innovative. Kasi when diniscuss niya yung idea of grievability, kaya nga ang title was From Otherness to Grievability, I could say that to some extent otherness and grievability are synonymous, kasi when we talk about otherness, it is also the reason why we also in Levinas philosophy, when we talk about death, diba, is contrary to the Heideggerian thinking na death is simply the end of everything. But when Levinas comes in the picture, Levinas would revert it. Levinas would say that That is simply the very impetus, the very start of more responsibility na dahil sa death of the other, we would become more responsible for him. And it's precisely because the other, of his otherness and everything. And that is how Derrida would even read Levinas din na yung sa Adieu, parang nabanggit niya doon na whenever he reads Levinas works, hindi siya yung namamaalam ng adieu kay Levinas, but it was Levinas who bids adieu to Derrida. Now, ayun nga po, very innovative yung way of reading because when we talk about the grievability, meron na siyang political dynamic. Whereas when we talk about the politics in Levinas, medyo may pagka-systematic pa siya na to the extent na the subject, the other, then papasok yung the third party or the third other or the other na parang that complicates the whole relationship, and that complication becomes a more of a radicalization of his responsibility. But what is surprising about Butler's idea of grievability is that na-skip niya yung third. Parang she just went in to say that every other is grievable, and yung in the Force of the Nonviolence merong idea of equal grievability because in as much as we are interdependent with each other, like Levinas, parang we are interdependent, we are not individualist, we owe it to each other to safeguard one another. It's precisely because, well, the other is grievable, and we have to form these conditions to create life. Yun pa yung unang comment ko po. Medyo innovative yung way kung paano sinulat ni Judith Butler yung Ang second yung nga po, meron maganda rin po yung idea na mayroong criticality din si Butler on Levinas, especially yung ideas niya dun sa Zionist critique na may nabanggit, where yung contradiction ni Levinas na bakit ang Nazi daw, ang mga SS merong face pero ang Palestinians wala. And I also found that contradiction very curious. Kasi when we talk about these interviews, itong mga latter political convictions ni Levinas is not, I'm not going to say that Levinas is silent on political issues, but rather yung mga sinulat niya is scattered throughout his many books. Tapos parang medyo mahirap makahanap ng ng parang clear-cut, pero more or less, madami siyang nabanggit about politics. Pero ayun nga lang, siguro hindi nga lang napansin na naging contradictory din si Levinas on that extent. Although, Roger Borgrave even noted that there was a time that even Levinas condemned the Zionist massacres. So, siguro yun din yung parang viable response din against kay Butler. Now, the question of whether magiging Butlerian or Levinasian po yung approach ko. I think in a way we could separate the two din naman po while naiintindihan po sila. I mean, just like how Derrida criticizes Levinas, dumarating din naman sa point na yung criticism din ni Derrida can also become an affirmation of his philosophy. And siguro that's the way on how I see Butler. Hindi although maganda yung criticism, pero not necessarily destructive of his philosophy. Ayun po. I hope I got the question correct po.
Thank you, Andre. One last question before I yield the floor to others. So, how do you size up yung severe criticism of Butler against Levinas? Do you think fair ba yun? Or is she giving a fair assessment of the position of Levinas?
I mean, ayun po, to some extent, I cannot blame Butler kung bakit ganun po yung criticism po niya. Kasi nga po, nahanap niya po on one reading po. I think, more or less naman, madami namang yung philosophers ay whenever they make criticisms, they based on one book. And I think, hindi naman po bago sa mga philosophers po yun. Would I call it unfair? Yes. Pero would I call it unfair? To some extent, oo. Pero I cannot blame Butler kasi nga, the literature ng Levinas when it comes to his political convictions is so scattered. Tipong, may sinabi si Levinas dito sa libro na ito, tapos may sinabi siya ulit in another book na medyo connected. And syempre, we won't, as a first-time reader of Levinas, we won't even know kung na meron pala siyang sinabing iba, di ba? Yung meron pala siyang sinabing iba. Well, yeah, I think I find it na, is it unfair? I guess so, but would I blame Butler? Oo, kasi in a way, ako rin naman, since yung thesis ko is on nonviolence and I'm trying to assess the political dynamics of Levinas, minsan I have to dive into the literature of his Judaic works. Kaya minsan you can just find gold na yun para minsan pala may isang article na banggit yung pala yung criticism of the cafe, wherein ang sa cafe daw parang it's just a place for indifference na parang you don't care about the world. Pero mahahanap mo yun on a certain article in his book na parang hindi siya masyado napapansin. Ayun po, Doc. Thank you po.
Okay, salamat, Andre.
Thank you, Sir Jovi. Any more questions po for Andre? Ayan na. Si Sir Pau na po ito ng totoo. Sir Pau, your questions po. Wala. Tama, di ba?
Yes,
Sir
tama.
Hello.
Yes po, sir. Apo.
Yeah. Hindi ko na pindot kasi I'm using my phone. Pero napilitan lang ako magtanong dahil tinawag mo ako kanina eh. Anyway, I'm just kidding. Anyway, Andre, so again, thank you for sharing your work in progress, no? And it seems like this is the project that you are envisioning for your master's thesis. But perhaps we could help each other clarify what is it exactly that you are trying to do. Or if it's not yet clear, hopefully this discussion would help you clarify what you want to do. The criticism of Butler of Levinas is, of course, is obvious, no? However, what Butler is doing with Levinas is more than a criticism, because while she criticizes Levinas, as a matter of fact, she's offering a kind of reinterpretation or a rereading of Levinas that makes Levinas's notion of the face of the other more radical, no? More radical than how we are led to understand Levinas originally. So, but one of the aspects of Butler's criticism is that while Levinas offers us a moral or ethical, some kind of ethical grounding for understanding responsibility and our duty towards others. And actually, you mentioned it early. It seems like Levinas doesn't offer us a clear political philosophy. uh, however, if you consider his ethical, his ethical philosophy, or moral philosophy, it can only make sense against the backdrop of social and political reality, right? It cannot stand on its own apart from making sense of it within the context of uh, material life, no? And by material life, I mean social and political reality. As a matter of fact, Levinas's ontology, no, not ontology. Levinas's moral philosophy, his ethics, is based precisely on what transpired during the Holocaust. It's built on that. It's not built on some. That's why ethics is first philosophy for him, because ethics is not built on some abstract idea of what is good. And that's also why he uses the figure of the face, a very concrete figure, because uh, even if you don't know the person, you don't know the name of the person, you see the face of the person. Uh, and for him, that is the for Levinas, that's the most visceral ground for ethics. However, it seems like the political grounding of that ethics is not it's not something that commentators elaborate on, and that's one thing that Butler points out. And so therefore, now going, if I ask you the question, then what is it exactly that you want to do, or if you want a suggestion, perhaps what you can do is to identify that uh, not necessarily deficit, no, or but then from the point of view of Butler, it could be a deficit in Levinas. It could be a political philosophy, a deficit for social political discourse. Uh, by identifying that, uh, then you could make a case that there's something more to Levinas, right? That it's possible to talk about his social political philosophy. And you can do that by using Butler as a point of departure. And at the same time, also looking at Butler's reinterpretation of the ethics of the other, right? Um, uh, so is that what you want to do? Do you agree? Then you said that Butler's criticism of of Levinas is unfair. Uh, but she does point out something, and she does offer a kind of by for lack of a better term, a kind of solution to the deficit, right? But by providing a reinterpretation, not only at the level of the face-to-face encounter, but also at the global level, no? A more macro level, no? The level of global politics. I was wondering if that's something that you want to do, no? Kasi or do you want to defend Levinas from Butler, or do you want to build, a social political philosophy based on your reading of Levinas and Butler? Butler here um, becomes an impetus for the possibility of building that social and social political philosophy. But at the same time, I think and this is where I suppose your thesis will be worthwhile. I think that you need to also acknowledge the deficit in, if not Levinas himself, the deficit in the way we usually read Levinas. No? Sige, yun lang muna.
Okay po, Doc. Thank you po. Okay, dami pong ideas po. Sige, simulan po natin sa political philosophy ni Levinas. First po, when we talk about the idea, when we talk about the political in Levinas, we understand the subject, the other, and the entry of the third, in which pagpasok po ng third, yung mag-start of from the asymmetrical to the symmetrical relationship with everyone else, na kumbaga we have to be responsible for every other and other and other, kasi yun po yung niya. Ayun po, actually po, yung paper na to is actually an offshoot ng thesis ko. Kasi after kasi when working on the RL, parang medyo na-invest ako sa pagbabasa ng other works ni Butler, kaya parang naisip akong gawa ng siguro another separate paper about it. Although some of these ideas ay ilalagay ko rin sa thesis ko. Now balik na sa political philosophy na when we talk about yung political philosophy na self-other and the third other, me and Doc Fer would agree na parang to some extent Levinas stop there. Parang kaya napansin din ni Doc Fer na bakit sa sa outline ko parang sobrang dami kong secondary source. It's precisely because the Levinasian scholars, sina Grave, Robert Bernasconi, Simon Critchley, would talk about the political. Mas maganda yung mas elaborate yung discussions nila ng political. Example po yung sa discussion ni Simon Critchley na yung the ethics of deconstruction is understanding how the ethics of Levinas can become a viable social critique, that social structure should be re-evaluated back towards the other. Kaya siya medyo deconstructive in a sense na we have to rethink the social structures if whether it is built upon a ontology of becoming for the other. Yung to some extent yun po yung social philosophy na innovate po ng mga Levinasian scholars. Kaya to some extent, I think si Butler ay parte siya dun sa mga nakakagawa nun. Although, si Butler ang isa sa pinaka-unique way kung paano niya na-politicize ang idea ni Levinas. It's precisely because skinip niya yung idea of the third. Yung parang systemic idea na yung when we are responsible for the other will become responsible for the third, and to some extent, since the third also represents the institutions, the third may also become responsible for me. Kaya doon pumapasok yung asymmetrical, and din pumapasok yung I stand before all others who are equally others, and we are to become responsible for them, for all of them. Kaya to some extent siguro sa paper na ito, or in my thesis as well, I will have to have a dialogue then with Levinas and Butler na kailangan ipakilala yung the dynamic of the third. Kasi feeling ko very I'm not gonna say it's a crucial thing, pero it could actually help to radicalize the responsibility. Siguro kung if I would have a Venn diagram, parang sa gitna, halos karamihan, dun sila nakakasundo. Ang pinagkaiba lang talaga ni Butler on her side, sa side niya sa Venn diagram, is that nagbigay si Butler ng mas elaborate response against political tyranny, which is nonviolent resistance. And this is something na hindi masyado binabanggit kahit sa philosophy ni Levinas. Although Levinas has a form of criticism katulad ng discussion ni Simon Critchley na The Ethics of Deconstruction. So, yeah, parang I think I agree po na parang yun po, pero parang yun po, medyo ano rin po kasi ako, kaya I have to leave out the conclusion din po kasi as well. Feeling ko lang naman kasi I don't want to have a Levinize Butler or to Butlerize Levinas or anything. Pero I think kaya nga ang first endeavor muna is to trace muna yung ideas na na-pick up ni Butler, and at the same time to evaluate kung hanggang saan niya na-innovate, and at the same time intindihin kung bakit, kung saan yung disagreements and disengagements, and how could perhaps it would be resolved then if ever Levinas would have a dialogue with Butler. So ayun po.
Thank you, Andre. Meron po. Sir Pao, do you have any follow-up po? Or Sir Jovi? Yes po, sir.
Last na to, Venus, tsaka Patrick. I think Sir Pao is, I hope I got his point right, but I think Andre Pao is soliciting your intellectual position, no, regarding your reading of Butler and Levinas. No? And actually, earlier, I asked you a question. How do you assess Butler's reading of Levinas? In a very subtle way, I'm also trying to fish your intellectual position about this parang tension between these two giant intellectuals. Personally, I was hoping you would side with Butler. Kung ito ay para sa thesis, I think you need to make your stand or your point right from the start. Hindi pwedeng you will present Butler, praise her, and on the other hand, you will present Levinas and then affirm him, and then wala. I mean, it's okay if what we're doing is just the usual academic banter, no, like this. Pero sa thesis, sa palagay ko, that intellectual position, that stand should be made very straightforward. Kung sa tingin mo na, well, Butler radicalized Levinas, but she read him wrongly. Pero even that is a rather superficial philosophic position. Kailangan pa yung i-articulate. Kasi it's not just a choice between Butler and Levinas sa thesis. It's really, it's all about an argument. No? It's all about this single thought that you wish to sustain from chapter 1 to chapter 5. So, ano ba yung single thought na yun? Well, we admire the scope of what you've read on Levinas and side by side with Butler, pero where will these readings lead you to? That's the single thought that we are asking from you. Yun muna, Venus, Patrick.
Okay po. Thank you po, Dr. Jovi. Sa thesis ko po actually, kasi the aim of my thesis is a reconstruction of Levinas ethical responsibility as a form of nonviolent resistance. So parang ang aim ko po muna doon is to to reconstruct, to see how kung pwede maging form of nonviolent resistance ang ethical responsibility. And ang kinalaman ni Butler sa thesis ko is that isa siya sa nagbigay ng framework or yung working definitions as well when it comes to nonviolent resistance. And I would point out in my thesis na to sa mga nagsulat on nonviolence, si Butler ang may pinaka-close na affinities about it. So, ayun po kasi yung intention po kasi ng ng thesis ko. Now, siguro intellectual position po. Siguro I think it would be fair din po to say na I would say with Butler when it comes to ethical to nonviolent resistance, kasi mas clear yung discussion po niya and seeing yung progression of thought ni Butler from the precarious life until the force of nonviolence, malino siya na we have to build that understanding that life is precarious in a political sense means that we have to view the other as grievable in order to have a non-violent, in order to resist against violence without returning to the same force of violence. Yun po yung kumbaga stand ko if ever yun yung sa non-violent resistance po, kung yun po yung usapan po. Pero kapag ayun nga po, para yung banter po ba, kung magiging banter po ba siya, I think I would have to agree din kasi kung pupoint out ko lang kung saan nagkulang si nagkulang si Butler ng reading kay Levinas, di parang it's para in my opinion parang halos karamin din ng philosophers, ganun din yung case nila na parang isang reading lang naman na nabasa nila and then everything din po yung so when siguro kapag kung intellectual position po on this paper in particular po, I would rather discuss po more on Butler po, although siguro medyo may pagka-vis-a-vis pa rin siguro yung approach, pero in a way this is just to say na despite yung misreadings and everything, Butler was able to innovate a philosophy from Levinas na that would still stand even if kahit ganun yung and perhaps Levinas is just simply, if we are to make a dialogue again with her, parang supplementary na lang. Yun po.
Thank you for your answers and clarification, Andrea. Are there any more questions po? Maybe we can entertain more. Parang wala na po. So thank you, Andre, for your presentation.
Thank you po everyone.
Thank you, Venus, and thank you, Andre, and thank you to all the presenters for today and to all who participated in our work in progress session. Reminder lang po, bago po natin i-dismiss yung session, tomorrow po, May 1, Saturday, from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. is another session for Noche, Caroline Howe, Privileging Roots and Routes, Filipino Intellectuals and the Contest over Epistemic Power and Authority. Kung hindi pa po kayo nakakapag-register, just visit the department website and visit the Google form para po you can receive the link for the Noche session tomorrow. Kita-kits po bukas and maraming salamat po muli sa lahat ng nag-attend. Dinner po kayo, tapos na po ang ating session.
One more time.
Thank you
Bye-bye!
po.
Anton, tapos na yung session. Dali.